Hello, I'm Robert Rickover, an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska. My guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we've been having a series of conversations about F.M. Alexander's idea of what he called psychophysical unity, and he would hyphenate those words. And we talked about it and about some of the implications of that. And this is going to be more implications of that. So, Imogen, thank you for making this conversation possible.
You're welcome. It's always interesting, and I'm looking forward to this part 3.
Right. Well, I want to just start with something that Alexander says in Constructive Conscious Control. He's basically saying earlier, well, I got this language problem. There are no words to describe properly what I want to say or what points I'm trying to make. And, he's going to use the word physical or the word mental, but he says the two, meaning the physical and the mental, must be considered entirely interdependent and even more closely knit than is implied by such a phrase. So he's saying, yep, they're entirely interdependent, and there's more, and I have no way of describing that more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the question, and I think I agree with that statement. I think he's absolutely correct. Yeah. And I think it is really the core of the Alexander technique, at least as most teachers would think of it, is that's true. They might have some different views about what mind-body unity means, but that idea is pretty fundamental. And what I'm interested in is what are the actual implications of that on a practical level, and in particularly on the practical level of how do you use directions, how do you inhibit the big things that we're mm-hmm. supposed to be good at, teaching people and using ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. So there it is. That's Alexander's view. And, but it wasn't always easy for students to really get that. Alexander, talking in the 30s to George Trevelyan, he said, the trouble is none of my students will believe that all they need to do is think, and that the wish for the neck to be free, for example, will do the trick. We are so brutalized by our belief in doing and muscular tension. And Marjorie Barlow quotes him as saying, learning how to direct is learning how to think. How to think mm-hmm. without also tacking on some doing. And Walter says, lots of students wish the up to happen, but since they don't really set much store in the wish, they will just do a little bit just to make sure. Just to be on the safe side, they'll introduce just a little bit of doing. And there are other quotes. I'd like to, though, move to one by Marjorie Barstow, who didn't mm-hmm. address the issue in quite that way. But what she would say, and she said this quite often, she said, you people, in other words, people in some group, could be like 80 or 90 people, you people just won't believe how simple this work is. You just won't believe it. And I think what she's saying is Alexander's idea of psychophysical unity is a radically, I had the phrase somewhere. It's a radical simplicity, really. I mean, if
because
it's like if there's just one thing and it has both mental and physical aspects, that's a much simpler system than one where you push a button here and something happens over here. And it's way simpler, but that doesn't mean it's not challenging.
for sure, because it goes against the habits of a lifetime and the habits of a whole culture, you know.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. And I think the term radical simplicity really covers it, because it's a radical thing he's saying. And if you buy into it, which I do, if you really buy into it, it's going to help. It's going to solve a lot of your problems in terms of how do you improve yourself, given that you are this radically simplistic system.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but I got back pain, or my neck is tight. I know it's all radically one thing, but what does that imply for how I could change it? Right? And I would say that it implies that the lightest thought about what you want is not only all you need. If you tack on any more, it's going to somewhat diminish the power of that thought. And if you tack on a lot of stuff like, oh, my neck is free, but I could help out a little bit.
Yeah, I better just
or I could be checking in constantly. Hey, what's going on? All of that takes away from it. And I think if you could get to the point where you really got that radical simplicity, you'd be a lot less likely to fall into that trap. If you thought of yourself as this fully integrated system that he's talking about, more integrated than you can even understand because there are no words for it, you would have the same level of belief in it that you might believe that your car is green, or purple or red,
whatever color
it is. There's not even a question.
So there's nothing to do about it,
and you think, oh, that's my car, it's a red whatever. Most of us, I don't think, are at that level when it comes to self-directing.
No, what you're saying is like we just know that the car is whatever color it is. There's nothing we have to do about it, but we kind of don't know that all we have to do is think.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
but I do have a devil's advocate. I think to have this role in life sometimes, to be the devil's advocate. I'm thinking of a conversation we had when I was training, and we were kind of talking about is direction always purely a thought, which I guess is what we've been getting at, is that's what we're after. We're after that. We're not doing anything to try and make the direction happen. We're just thinking the thought and letting it do its work, right?
Right.
So the question we were talking about was, what if you're sitting like this? Can you simply just direct? I know if I direct, something helps, but it's not. I'm going to have to actually move. It seems like.
Yeah. Well,
maybe if I directed long enough, it would happen. But this seems like it's helpful in that situation to move. So I'm curious at your thoughts on that, Robert, and anyone watching.
Here's my take on that, and I owe this really to Marjorie Barstow, because she addressed that question very directly in a practical way when she was working with people. She would put her hands on someone's neck, and she might say, now just move your head delicately away from your torso in such a way that your torso follows. Now, that's a word.
So my question is, there seems to be some doing. It's not just a thought. There's a movement.
There's a movement, but you know what? I think unless you're dead, there's always movement.
Well, that's true. That's true. And if you're under a teacher's hands, there can be an allowing that you're not doing it. You're allowing. But if you're literally on your own and you want to come out of a deep slump, I think you have to do something.
Well, I agree.
Maybe.
I think you do, but you have to do it using a useful non-doing direction.
True. And I agree. Yeah.
And I think you can even once you, I think you can actually, even without a teacher, learn to do that, because you're taking a direction into movement. And Marge was very big on getting people to move at least a little bit. She'd work on people in a chair. Oh, why don't you come forward a little bit and come back, or move your arms around a little so you can integrate this. You can take this new freedom, but integrate it into simple, ordinary activities. That you're not just sitting there for hours pretty still while someone just pours direction into you, which is kind of a model that you do see sometimes. Certainly in my training course, there was a fair amount of that. I think there's a quote of Marge somewhere that there really are no correct positions. It's life's about movement. You're going to be moving all the time until you stop. I remember reading an obituary of an Alexander teacher that at the time I thought was just insane Alexander jargon, but maybe not. The writer said, this lady, she just finally stopped doing. Well, yes, she didn't do anything because she was dead. But most of us, hopefully, are not dead. We're not zombies. We actually are alive, and we want to go through life in a better way, and directions are a really good way to do that. So directions are kind of designed to work best in the context of at least a little movement, So that's how I would answer it. But there may be other. I would love to hear from other answers to your question from other people, because.
And I like the idea of thinking of it as that it's the movement, not the position, and you can direct yourself in a movement, so you're not prescribing the how that's going to happen so much.
Yeah. I mean, you just take the example of someone sitting in a chair. Let's say they're even using the backrest. So really, they're not in an obvious way really doing much of anything, but of course they're breathing and blood circulating and so on. You could, if you ask them to think a direction, it's quite likely that there will almost certainly be a little change if they're directing well. They may or may not be able to notice it when they're first starting lessons, but it's going to be there. So I don't think movement's the enemy.
No,
movement's
absolutely
really
not.
Movement's the purpose.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
Yeah. I can kind of see two sides of it. Yeah. Just with the example, if someone was just like sitting and is very hunched over.
Yeah.
And you just say, oh, well, you can just direct. It's like, how about we try this movement? as you think,
Right.
whatever. It would be a little bit of a different approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
So, do you have any other thoughts on this particular topic?
Well, I was just thinking about the word integration, and one definition I've kind of come across recently is that it's the linkage of differentiated parts. So they're differentiated, but they make up a whole. So it's a slightly different way of saying, I think, actually the same thing that you were saying that FM was getting at. Linkage sounds more separate to me, but of course, its linkage is anyway. That's a definition I've come across recently of integration, and thinking that fits in somehow, but also this idea of a whole. And so, in that differentiated parts, if we're thinking like that, that's not only mind and body, that's different parts of the body, and the whole system working as one. And so a direction could be directed more globally, it could be more general, or it could be quite specific, but it's still going to have an effect on everything because we can't separate out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe you could say a correlate to this, because it is a challenge for people at the beginning. As Alexander said, this is learning how to think, and that most people don't know how to think in the way he's talking about. They'll have an idea, and they'll also have a little doing going on as well. But so given that that's a challenge for new students, the psychophysical or mind body, you could switch it to, because if it's mind body, it's body mind, it's physical psycho. That especially for new students, it's going to be very useful to take advantage of that second pathway, which is simply putting yourself in a physical position that encourages the kind of release that you would hope to get later by just thinking. So being in constructive rest is the classic one. I think that's why constructive rest is maybe one of the most important entry points for people who want to get a little bit of an idea about what the technique can do on their own, because it's easy to do. And many people will find that when they get up from constructive rest, they're taller. They'll feel it.
Yeah.
And it won't last, but it's there for a while. So you know for sure it's a possibility. Or I think I've become kind of a fan of power poses. They do the same thing. They take you, it's a physical movement that basically lifts your center of gravity, expands the upper part of your body. You don't have to think about it. You just have to do it. So it's pretty easy. Or the position of mechanical advantage that's sometimes talked about. All of these are things that give you some experience of what might be possible for you to create with just a thought later on, and make it easier for you to later on start being a little more secure in just using a thought, because you've already seen one side of that psychophysical, the physical psycho, how that works. So if physical psycho works, well, psychophysical is likely to work too. So I think it actually kind of elevates the importance, especially at the beginning for new students, to do some of the physical psycho stuff that is easy to do, really easy to do. Anyone can do it. Maybe you need a little bit of guidance from a teacher to get the right book height and stuff like that. But basically, that's something that's doable by anyone on their own. And power poses, same thing. You can look at pictures of people doing power poses, and you can do them yourself. It's not rocket science. So I just wanted to add that little addendum. The power of psychophysical is also the power of physical psycho, and you might as well use it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
No, just thinking about what you're saying about constructive rest or power poses, is that just showing how the kind of the interrelatedness and oneness and a possible virtual circle rather than a vicious circle would be, then you can be adding consciously the directions to those things, and then that improves the physical stuff, and it's just like this.
Totally, it's a positive feedback loop.
Yeah,
but I'm just talking about someone at the beginning is having a
absolutely
rough time wrapping their minds around this radical simplicity thing that we talked about. Well, just lie down with knees bent, all that stuff for 10 or 15 minutes. Get up and see what you notice. Yeah. Anything else you want to add?
I don't think so, but I like this idea, this term, radical simplicity.
I came up with it. I woke up in the middle of the night and that thought came into my mind. Isn't that weird? So just another shout out to anyone watching this, listening to the podcast version of it, which will come a little later. If you have something to say about this, let us know. If it's, we'll even do an interview with you if it seems like it's going to be helpful, because you and I don't have the answers here. I mean,
we're talking about questions.
We're struggling with it ourselves. But I do think it's central to the Alexander technique, and it hasn't been addressed as such, I would say. That's my feeling. Whatever. Okay, so my guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington. I'm going to put a link to her site, my site, a site to tell you more about the technique, and links to the 2 earlier podcasts that we've done, because they lay some of the groundwork of this in more detail. Okay, Imogen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.